Hello, welcome to Information Revolution, a podcast for people who care about information. My name's Judi Vernau, and I'm an information architect. I work for a company called Metataxis in Wellington. Next.
My name is Michael Upton. I call myself an information management consultant, and I also work for Metataxis.
And my name's Karl Melrose. I work for Castlepoint Systems in Canberra, but just a very quick disclaimer, my views are my own. So, Judi, what are we here to talk about today?
Well, I suggested, rashly or otherwise, that we talk about knowledge management, which is a term that I haven't heard for quite a little while, and I wondered whether it was still considered to be a thing, or whether we don't talk about that, we just talk about information management, or are there organisations out there who think more about knowledge management? I mean, as far as I know, it was a term that came up in the 1990s, I think, and was quite voguey around that time, and primarily focused on the tacit to explicit information management side of things. So trying to get out what's in people's head so that it can be shared around the organization. And I think there was this division between managing new information and managing the established information. But how can we make all of that available to people? And I think, I don't know whether it's something that people actually think about in that way, or are we perhaps so focused on just trying to manage what we've got, which Lord knows is hard enough, that we don't spend so much time trying to, as it were, educate or draw out that tacit information. There are lots of things I know around the place. I mean, communities of practice, for example, is one way of doing that, I know. Or knowledge bases, but I was wondering what you two thought about that. Do we think about knowledge management now? And if so, do you see people doing things around it?
One thing I'd say is that I see some government agencies, at least, where they talk about a knowledge management function separate to an information or records management function,
Right.
and they really mean looking after a knowledge base that
Hmm.
serves people who are customer facing. So, basically, if you're going to take a phone call or you're going to answer customer requests, or not necessarily customers, I suppose. We've talked about customer as a term before, but citizens getting in touch with the government agency. Yeah, I often see that people like that's knowledge management for some people. And to me, I find that kind of, I was going to say I find it amusing. I don't find that amusing, but I do see it as being almost like distinguishing things based on subject or use rather than the kind of thing it is. As in, you must have a lot of corporate knowledge in those organizations, and well, of course there is. Um, but it's kind of saying, okay, our knowledge management function exists to look after one kind of thing.
There's a
And to me, it's almost like with records people, if they say, oh, I only look after the EDRMS or I only look after the um, paper records or something. To me, it kind of leaves me feeling a bit like, oh, but that doesn't feel like the complete picture. And there might be good reasons for doing it, but yeah. So yeah, just to summarize, I hear knowledge management mostly used talking about knowledge base management. Like how do we build a thing that people can go to and get authoritative answers to questions
there's a
quickly.
little tongue-in-cheek part of me that
Mm-hmm.
wants to know whether it's just the place where we go from a functional classification to a subject or topic-based classification.
Oh, interesting.
Uh,
That's a really interesting way of
And that was
thinking
the thing I
about
thought
it.
about when you're talking about that,
yeah,
because that's obviously if people are trying to answer questions. Well, we're just classifying information by subject now, which sorry, that's completely not
yeah,
serious,
it is
but sort of interesting.
yeah. I mean, I think another angle I've seen is that there is that kind of focus on, knowledge is, oh gosh, I don't even remember the distinctions people make, but something about knowledge is answers to how do I or something,
Yeah,
and
knowledge
other
is
kinds
how
of
to
information. Yeah, which I just find gets really curly and just sort of academic and just wonky, because of course you can use any kind of information to help you understand how you might do something. Yeah, but I do see that distinction. So, for example, they might do the some kind of frequently asked questions on an intranet. That might be
Mm,
treated as
mm,
knowledge and
mm.
managing knowledge. Um, yeah, which I think again is basically just uh, creating a set of questions and answers. So I don't know.
Yeah, one of the things I
Mm.
keep
Well,
seeing
you
is that I keep seeing knowledge teams popping up in organisations, and then when I go and talk to them, it's just another attempt to get that the organisation that the group is making in the organisation to get away from records. So they've decided that records is having a bad time in the
Yep.
organisation, so now they call themselves the knowledge team. But most of the time, I look at the functions that the team performs in the organisation, and what I see is a records team, and not we talk. I've got a really expansive view of what records is and what records should do in an organisation, and I don't think I'm talking about that either. I'm talking about teams that are managing the EDRMS and trying to get people to put their records in there, and so it's really just it's become a branding exercise, which I think's really disappointing because I think knowledge management and the whole learning company movement that came out of it,
mm.
that idea that companies can learn, um, I think I think it's a wonderful dream, and I think it's also, if we look at all of the literature that's popping up about complex adaptive systems and how organizations need to adapt to the environment they're in and those kinds of things, I think that's where the whole knowledge management movement was really going. And it started obviously. We Judi, you mentioned, kicking off in the early 90s, when Nonaka and Takeuchi came out with the Seki model, that idea that we would make things, take things from being tacit to explicit. And, kind of
Mm.
by chewing through that knowledge spiral, we would create new knowledge and allow the organization to do new things. That's obviously it's quite an academic idea, but I think there's a huge amount of veracity in it for lots of organizations that I don't think we see when people sit down and say, right, now we want to take this process that you're doing because you've got the knowledge to do it, and we want to try and make its decision steps explicit. I don't think we see the richness of those ideas come out in that sort of thing. That said, for me, I love to bang on about the Dakar model. And you guys have heard me. That's data, information, knowledge,
Mm.
actions, and results. Um, it's a way of tying the results that the organization's achieving to the quality of the actions it's taking, the quality of the actions it's taking to the knowledge that it has, and the quality of the knowledge, which is basically, stuff in people's heads and its ability to make decisions. And then, that knowledge can only act with the right information and which really brings in the whole information data records piece. And so to me, that's the opportunity there to start saying, here is how the quality of our information has an impact on the quality of our results, and knowledge becomes a part of that as well. So that's where it fits to me. And I know that I've published
Sure.
that on my blog, and I know that there are some people who have really got something out of Dakar and are starting to use it in their programs. And I didn't invent it, just being really clear.
Yeah.
At best, I've socialized it a little bit, but I guess it depends a lot on how we determine what knowledge is. And lots of people who are purists will say that knowledge only exists in our head. Once it's out of our head, it's information of some kind.
Yeah, some people do say that. And is it just about getting that knowledge out of your head, as I was saying earlier, or is there a more proactive thing as well? Going back to
Yeah,
that,
the communities of practice that you were talking
capturing
about
the
before.
tacit.
I mean,
Yeah, capturing the tacit and publishing the stuff that the organisation already knows, so that everybody can know it, which is partly what an intranet tends to do these days. There are different ways of doing that. But I mean, I can remember in the 1990s and 2000s, people even thinking about, well, what notices should be put up on the board that will help people to understand this or that. I have to say, the organisation that I'm working with at the moment has weekly sessions where one team will do a talk online about their area so that everybody can understand what's going on in that area. That's a kind
Mm,
of knowledge management, isn't it?
Mm.
It's a sharing. It's getting
it's
stuff out of one
socialization.
head so that other people can socialization. Thank you very much. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And
Yeah, and
maybe people
I've
are
seen that
doing
too.
it. Yeah. Maybe people are doing it, but they just don't talk about it like that anymore.
Mm.
There's one government agency I can think of in Wellington who explicitly combine information and knowledge management as a function, and I don't think they're doing it as a rebranding thing. Carl, you mentioned earlier, I do see that trend around town where people go, maybe if we call ourselves knowledge, we'll get different respect, different respect. Um, but uh, but yeah, and that they would have a knowledge strategy as opposed to
Right.
an information strategy. They would have specifications about the quality of knowledge and what they're doing with it, rather than as well as for instance a record specification. Um, so yeah, so I'm seeing it a little bit, and for those kinds of organisations, I mean, it does make it clear that there's this whole set of skills and activities around trying to do things like socialization and things that I do think go beyond what a normal, an information function or a records function would normally do. Yeah.
I mean, are you seeing communities of practice and those kinds of things pop up within larger organizations? Because that to me, how you get one of the things that I've been trying to figure out in Adelaide for ages is how we get really good practice to spread. Because we've got a couple of practitioners here that I think are I think they're quite a bit ahead of other practitioners just in terms of the success they're having in their organizations and because their practice is materially different and they are getting different results. And so how do we get those practices to spread so that other people can start to adopt the bits that make sense for their organization and get materially different results as well? And, I've been trying to bring people together in a community of practice type thing for years, but I haven't been able to get it to happen, really. And that's so I'm curious about whether you're seeing communities of practice popping up, because that is one of those real, those tools that really is supposed to be in the knowledge manager's kit bag.
Yes, that same organisation I was talking about, they're exploring that and trying to make that happen, and yeah, trying to basically um, probably, I mean, only to a small amount, but trying to formalize roles around that, like trying to sort of go, okay, these are the things you would need, and these are the people who need to do certain things in order to keep a community of practice going.
And are
Um,
those communities of practice around topics or around particular ways of doing things or particular kinds of information, or what sort of common thread is
Things I'm
there?
thinking of are topics, a
Right.
topic based. So, a topic related to work, basically. So, Um, I'm seeing it at the moment in another government agency I'm doing work in. They, within their kind of information area, they have communities of practice for each of privacy, information management, and information security, where they use those to share knowledge across sort of domains or disciplines within their information area, which I think is pretty nice. But the other organisation I was thinking of, it could be anything. Like if they have a legal, it might be, about legal matters or whatever. Um, I thought I'd throw in that I am seeing. I feel like I'm almost like a Microsoft shill, which I'm certainly not. But I
You're not
am
going to talk
seeing
about
that,
Viva topic cards now, are you?
oh, look, I actually wasn't even going to go there, but the Viva Engage, formerly known as Yammer, but apparently rebranded as
Oh,
Viva Engage. Um, the whole point of that,
yeah.
as far as Microsoft stated it, was supposed to be building up online communities of practice, basically in the style of old school web forums. And I generally don't really see that taking off very well. Like I said, but I wonder about the relationship between that and a lack of knowledge management. Like, I wonder if it's kind of the same as, or equivalent to, just thinking you just turn on Teams for everyone and off you
Mm,
go, and now you're managing documents well.
mm.
Is it same kind of thing? Like, hey, we'll turn on Viva Engage and then start a community on IT because it's normally IT people, and then see what happens next.
It is a very
Yeah.
But
cultural
Um,
thing, isn't it? And it's, I mean, it's
yeah.
yeah.
interesting. You just reminded me of the company that owns WordPress, even though WordPress is open source. I think they own WordPress.com, and I think they contribute anyway. I forget.
Yeah, there is a WordPress
Yeah,
company.
but they one of the things they talk about is a written culture that they have, where they actually use WordPress forums to make all of their really big business decisions. But in order to make sure that they kind of, they do as much sense making throughout the whole organization as they can, if they've got to make big decisions, they post these things to a WordPress forum internally. And then the whole company basically gets an opportunity to chime in. And what I love about it is that it means that they've got a record of, because they have this written culture, they have a record of how and why
Hmm.
every single significant business decision that they've ever made was made, that they can refer back to anytime they like. But there does also then seem to be very much a knowledge. It provides an opportunity for people to understand how the organization functions and how it is thinking about the world. And I see that as a really quintessential kind of knowledge managey. There you go, new term that I've just coined right there, knowledge managey type thing. And as you're talking about forums and those sorts of things, I mean, I think a large part of when you get right down to it, knowledge management, a large part of it is trying to make cultural that practice of sharing knowledge with other people, and also asking questions. Okay, I don't know how to do. I've got this thing I have to do. How do I make sure I do it the absolute best I can by using the knowledge that our organization already has? And every single time I've ever bumped into knowledge management somewhere, somebody's quoted, Lou Platt, I think it was either HP or IBM, it was one or the other, who said that, if HP knew what HP knows, we'd be 3 times as profitable. Must obviously be HP, because otherwise it would be, a bit
Strange.
strange. But I feel like that's what we're kind of driving at. It's that how do you make it cultural, the desire to share and get people away from silos. And I mean, I think particularly in government, where, I mean, it is the home of the bureaucratic organisation. Functional divisions and very clear lines of responsibility, and it is kind of the home of the antithesis of that idea.
I think, yeah,
Yeah.
I mean,
Disagree,
the getting
please.
people to share. No, I wasn't going to. Getting people to share is a problem in all kinds of all kinds of organisations. I think, in my experience, it doesn't just pop up in
Yeah.
government, and that getting people to share has been all about the information management. When I run my information architecture course, right at the start, I get them to talk about their pain points. So, what are the things that you struggle with in your organization? And we write them down, and the word silo comes up absolutely every time.
Hmm.
There's no way we can share, or there's no way people are willing to share, and we can't look at anybody else's stuff. And I guess knowledge management, part of that is making sure that you can see, making sure you can see other people's stuff, but also presenting other people's stuff. So the proactive as well as the reactive, if you see what I mean.
I mean, I almost see it sometimes as forming a
Yeah.
people-based search engine.
Right.
You know, because that's
Oh,
the.
yes, of course.
I mean,
Yeah.
ultimately, that's why we go to people with knowledge. It's the fastest way to understand. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, I've thought of these things before on a kind of speed continuum. You know, where you've got information down one end, and I'm sure I have a book here somewhere on. I have 14 books on knowledge management. I have a book on knowledge management. So if I want to understand knowledge management, I can read the books that I've got on knowledge management, or I can go and ring a mate of mine who has spent significant, who maybe we should get on the show, who spent a significant portion of his
Yeah.
career working in knowledge management and trained in knowledge management, and I can go, hey, can you tell me about this thing? And I know that the knowledge I need is probably in these books I've got, but if I ring him, I'm going to get it really fast. I'm going to get it distilled.
Yeah.
He understands how to apply it to the situation. I mean, on that speed continuum, if you've got if you have a context that you need to deal with, knowledge is orders of magnitude faster than any other way of getting access to this stuff. And that's so tacit to explicit. Putting it on a file, giving ourselves access to the silo that other people are in. But the problem with that is that you fall into that search problem that, if you want to find out how to write an enterprise agreement, well, the document about how to write an enterprise agreement is number 14,000 in your search result for enterprise agreement, behind the 500,000 enterprise agreements that you've already written and all of the drafts of that document.
Yeah, and some organizations, when they ask you to fill in your personal profile, ask for lots more information. And I'd forgotten that because I hadn't seen it for so long. But not just who are you, what's your role, what team do you work in, but actually tell us something about what you're doing. Tell us about what you consider your expertise to be, so that people can search this. I need someone who knows about this.
Yeah.
Oh, I'll do a search.
Yeah.
Oh, they know. I'll ask them. What a good idea. I'd forgotten that because I just don't see it
Yeah.
anymore.
I guess.
Yeah. I've seen it a few times, but not often, and not always kind of just with that enthusiasm about what a good idea it is, rather than
Right.
really seeing it come to light.
But
Yeah.
there's an underlying element there, though, too, of respect for knowledge and respect for learning. And
Yeah.
it's just, I mean, kind of getting into cultural stuff quite quickly, but I wonder how culturally that plays in Australia. At least my side of the pond. Because we've got this idea that Australia is a really egalitarian society and everything else, and what we do is we're actually a tall poppy. Tall poppy syndrome was kind of born here. Every time somebody sticks their head up, culturally, we don't like that very much. But it really also gets in the way of this idea that people can have more value because they know more things than other people. And so I think there is a tendency in Australia to discount the value of knowledge that other people have, and to see things and to treat things as simpler than they are. And I wonder then about how effective you can be with that type of strategy if people don't fundamentally sit there and say, well, somebody with 20 years of experience at making bread slicing machines, they must know something that I don't. So I'm going to go and talk to them when I need to understand how to make a bread slicing machine, instead of just sitting down and saying, well, how complicated can a bread slicing machine possibly be? Which I think is the tendency most of the time. And I think that's the tendency of bureaucratic organizations as well. I mean, I think, the tendency of bureaucratic organizations is to operate at the level of knowledge that the people at the top have. They kind of sit down and say, right, what's the thing we need to do? And then the bureaucratic process, you're supposed to map it all out and develop business processes. And then you're supposed to bring people in who are relatively interchangeable. And so what place does knowledge play in that?
And I guess, I mean, you'd see it every day that from the bottom up that everyone can answer that question. Everyone can say, "Oh my gosh, if that person leaves, we're
Yes.
really in the doo doo."
Yeah.
I think in terms of those cultural aspects, I think one thing that's definitely on my mind, reflecting on silos and things, is what are the incentives to share? Like in real life, baked in the system. What are the incentives built into an organisation that would encourage people to share and put value on that, as opposed to basically have one up on someone else through the old truism about knowledge being power and rah rah rah. It's like, well, is it actually power in your organisation to be able to basically be perceived as the expert? And if would it be possible to kind of structure something where you're being seen as the greatest sharer? Like you raise up others the best. I'm sure that in terms of like socially, you might be really popular if you're that kind of a person, but in terms of your actual when it comes down to remuneration, etc., or promotion, is that something that would be easily
Ooh,
identified?
impossible to
Are there
measure.
organisations doing that kind of
Impossible to
stuff?
measure.
Well,
Yeah,
And
some
what would you
also,
do?
I think some
What would you?
organizations have tried that by insisting that you post, you do a certain number of posts per
Mm,
week
mm-hmm,
on your
mm-hmm.
area. So we want to see that, and then if you do that, there will be some kind of remuneration or perhaps lack of penalty.
Yeah, to be fair, actually, in like consulting companies, that's often structured as part of your performance criteria that will determine whether you get a bonus or whether you're out the door.
I,
Um, in the most
I mean,
severe cases, but it's a pretty rough measure.
Mhm.
Like, have you written something up? It's that one bit about tacit turned explicit,
Yeah.
rather than what if you shared heaps of what had been tacit, you make it explicit through sharing with other people, as in
but
talking to
that
them.
Hmm.
process of making
Yeah,
sure it's consumed as well. I mean, I guess we see it in academia. I mean, what do academia? What
right.
do you? You go to these sites that have academic papers on them, and what's the metric that they put next to a paper to show that it's important? Well, it's how many times has it been cited by other papers that are
Yeah.
published. And I mean, I think that's the other part of the and my remember how well I remember the Secchi model is not well at all, but the thing I remember is that they were talking about the spiral of knowledge creation and how that spiral is not just about, there's the sort of tacit to explicit piece, but there's also that reconsumption. And, how do you make sure that that knowledge gets consumed by people who don't have it so that it becomes new knowledge? And it was interesting for me a couple of years ago. I went and started talking to different businesses around Adelaide about, and really just an effort to understand how people thought. And the first time I talked to a partner at a law firm here, um, I remember him describing the sorts of things that they did inside the organisation as part of what he was calling information management, and what he was describing was knowledge management. He was talking about how he and some of the other partners would pass around recent decisions that had been made and written up, and they'd make sure that everybody read those, and they'd like they had this set of knowledge management things that they did that made sure that they were always building on that knowledge asset that they had in the firm. And the thing that I've found since then is that you don't struggle to get lawyers to share that information and to engage in what I'd call knowledge management type activities. They are always they're always looking for what is the next important case in the area that I work in, because they know that the difference between winning and losing for them is
Hmm.
is their
Yeah.
knowledge of those cases and their knowledge of precedents and those sorts of things. And it's interesting because I guess I think some of this also comes back to how do we measure. An area that we really struggle with, I think, in knowledge, information management, records management, data management, really is how do we measure the effectiveness of practice? Not its efficiency, but its effectiveness. And I mean, I think for in law, it's really clear. You've got a kind of win-loss ratio that, so you can measure the effectiveness of your people. But I mean, in information and records management, how do we measure the difference between good information management and not even bad information management, just slightly less good information management, so that we can really start to understand that there is a quality spectrum and to understand the knowledge that makes up that quality spectrum.
One thing that was on my mind thinking about the flavors of what we've been talking about so far is that I think there's kind of plenty of overlap between a bunch of different professional disciplines, and what we're talking about with knowledge management, I think knowledge management overlaps on one side with information management, and then on the other side with learning, like learning management
Yeah,
or learning and
Mm,
development or
definitely.
education within the organization. And I think it would be unusual for information management folks to be directly interfacing with sort of learning folks on what sort of inputs and feed, what sort of interrelationship you need there.
I love it.
But they, but the crossover between information and knowledge, I think there's really obvious things in what we've been saying that could happen within an organisation that doesn't say it does knowledge management, such as um, trying to encourage people to share, trying to encourage people to make explicit things. That is making records, right? Like let's turn some stuff from tacit, it's just in my head, to something that's recorded. That is literally making a
Where does it
record.
fit in your retention
So in our
schedule, though?
expansive view, well, that's the only thing we're supposed to talk
Yeah,
about in our
yeah,
jobs,
just
right? It's
retention.
just
Yeah,
retention schedules.
yeah.
God.
So yeah, so if we're taking that expansive view of records management and information management that we've been like encouraging for a year now, and millions of people before us, well, some people before us, um, if you're focusing on business problems, quality required to get on with your job well, effectiveness, efficiency, then you are kind of doing that piece, I think, around going from tacit to explicit. And if you're focused on sort of, well, how do people best access these things? Access has always been a concept in records management, maintaining access to things. Then, that also crosses over because it's also that thing of how do we consume it. But I guess what yeah, it does make me wonder what's not within that kind of, if we've got like a Venn diagram, what sits in a knowledge management that you would never say is part of information
So
management.
maybe it's that people thing then, the knowing
Yeah,
who to go and talk
Mm,
to. I can find it for
right.
myself with a bit of luck, um,
Yeah,
but knowing who to go and talk to, who the experts are, maybe that's the missing piece.
mm.
yeah. And I was thinking that communities of practice style stuff it'd be pretty unusual to have that sort of as your responsibilities in information and records. Like, hey, go around and establish these and
Mm.
like get people talking to each other better and share knowledge well that's not written down, not recorded. That would be
Some of those
unusual, I think.
practices too around identifying knowledge gaps, like you were saying, right at that pole, which is all about
Yeah.
learning and development, and making sure that the organisation has the right knowledge that it needs to produce the right results. I mean, I think that kind of thing,
Mm.
and trying to backfill that, looking at problems like disaster type preparedness,
Yeah.
looking at how, if this person disappears who has this key knowledge, well, what happens in the organization and how do we make sure that we start to get some of that knowledge shared around other people so that this is less of a problem. I think that sort of thing is unlikely to be part of information management, but probably very likely to be part of knowledge management.
Great.
I think that's a good place to wrap it up today. Um, so we've been talking about knowledge management and what we think it is and what we think it isn't, and how it overlaps or doesn't with information management. I just wanted to say that we've referred a few times to the SECI model, and then just in case anybody doesn't know what that is or is trying to look it up, it's spelled SECI: socialization, externalization, combination, and internalization. So you might be
Nice.
interested to go and check that out. Um, so thank you very much. I think we should be it would be good to pick up on the measuring effectiveness topic sometime in the future.
Yep.
Uh,
Sounds great.
But in the meantime, thank you very much for watching and listening.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers all.